Hello, everyone, and welcome to session 4 of the inaugural Completed Life Conference. Today's session examines the completed life through an international lens, specifically the implications of medical aid in dying from a comparative point of view, from bioethics luminaries Jocelyn Downie from Canada, Agnes van der Heide from the Netherlands, and Ben White from Queensland, Australia. Jocelyn Downie is a university research professor in the faculties of law and medicine at Dalhousie University. She's a member of the Dalhousie Health Law Institute, and she thoroughly enjoys teaching healthcare ethics and the law, as well as legal ethics and professional responsibility in the faculty of law, and supervising a talented group of graduate students and postdoc fellows on various aspects of health law and policy. Agnes van der Heide is professor of end-of-life care and decision-making at the Department of Public Health at Erasmus, the University Medical Center in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. She was trained as a physician and epidemiologist and has been working in empirical end-of-life care research since 1995. Her research is focused on epidemiological, clinical, ethical, and legal issues in end-of-life care and end-of-life decision-making. Ben White is a professor and director of the Australian Centre for Health Law Research in the Faculty of Law at the Queensland University of Technology. Professor White's area of research focus is end-of-life decision-making, and his work is interdisciplinary with publications in law, medicine, bioethics, and social science journals. And I am Sarah Kiskadden-Bechtel, your host today and program director of the Completed Life Initiative. It's a delight to welcome you to session 4 today and welcome our incredible speakers. And I'd love to turn it over to Jocelyn to begin with a few introductory remarks looking at an overview of the session. So Jocelyn?
Well, good afternoon and evening and middle of the night for those in Australia. I'm delighted to be here and to be a part of this wonderful series of sessions that's put on by the Completed Life Initiative. So just a few quick words before we get going. Agnes, Ben, and I will give 3 country reviews. So we will look at Canada, Australia, and the Netherlands. And we will each cover the same terrain. So we're going to talk about the key features of the laws, the data that we have on practice, the paths that have been taken to law reform in each jurisdiction, and some future directions that we anticipate going in each country. Then we're going to have an exchange of bouquets and brickbats. In other words, a compliment and a criticism for each jurisdiction. And this is really to put a fine point on some of the differences between the systems. And then we're going to open it up for question and discussion with all of you. And we will have lots of time for that because we anticipate lots of questions. A few preliminary comments on terminology are necessary before we get going. The first is in relation to completed life. As you'll know, the Completed Life Initiative uses a broad understanding of this expression. And here I quote, "live life until its completion with self-determination and dignity at the end of life." Now, in the permissive jurisdictions that the 3 of us come from, completed life is actually narrowly used as a contested eligibility criterion. That is, where there is no terminal illness, where natural death is not yet reasonably foreseeable, and so on. It's a debate about whether it should be allowed in those circumstances, but that's very narrow. So for today's session, given the host and given what we want to talk about, we're going to use a broad understanding of completed life. The other comment on terminology relates to acronyms and expressions. The category of activity that we're going to be talking about in Canada is called MAiD, in Australia is called VAD. So medical assistance in dying, medical aid in dying, voluntary assisted dying, euthanasia, assisted suicide, death with dignity, and so on. This is what we will be talking about. We may use our jurisdiction's particular terms or acronyms as we go. I for sure will slip into talking about MAiD, but we're all talking about this general category of activities. So with those preliminaries dispensed with, I'm going to hand it over to Agnes to start us off with a review of assisted dying in the Netherlands. Agnes.
Thank you very much, Jocelyn and Sarah, for this nice introduction. And of course, thank you for having me in this meeting. I'm very happy to introduce you to the Dutch experience of, as we call it, euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. You may know that the Netherlands is a very tiny country in the middle of Europe, and I only notice now that unfortunately Australia is not on this map, but I'm sure you know that Australia is a very important country at the right bottom of this slide, of this graph. So the Netherlands, I think, is one of the countries with the longest experience of regulating and practicing physician assistance in dying. And I will introduce you a little bit to the how that has worked since about 30 or 40 years and how the practice is organized today. Some of the key features of the practice of physician-assisted suicide in the Netherlands. In 1985, so that is more than 40 years, 35 years ago, the government installed a committee to provide an advice on how to deal with the issue of euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. And already at that time, the following definitions were proposed, with euthanasia being the administration by a physician of a lethal substance to a person at their explicit request that intentionally causes their death. At that time, there was much confusion about what entailed euthanasia and what didn't. For example, stopping life-sustaining treatment was also often considered euthanasia at that time. But according to this definition, euthanasia only involves the administration of lethal medication. In addition to that, physician-assisted suicide was defined as the prescription or provision by a physician of a lethal substance to a person at their explicit request so that they can self-administer the substance and in doing so cause their own death. And it is important to realize, to be aware that euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide are, for the legal regulation, completely similar. The same criteria apply, the same procedures apply. The only difference from a legal point of view is that the sentence, if the physicians do not adhere to the safety criteria for either of these practices, is different, but the criteria themselves are completely similar for both practices. Well then, the debate that thus started already in the 70s and 60s of the former century in the end resulted in the so-called Termination of Life on Request and Assisted Suicide Act. And this is mainly an act that is aimed at providing physicians guidance in how to proceed when they think ending the life of one of their patients is the best option. And within this law, physicians are supported by the formulation of a number of due care criteria. In principle, physicians who perform euthanasia or assisted suicide are still committing a criminal offense, still today committing a criminal offense, but they are not criminally liable if they comply with a number of due care criteria. And they are summarized here. The physician must be satisfied that the patient's request is voluntary and well considered. The physician must be satisfied that the patient's suffering is unbearable and without prospect of improvement. The physician must have informed the patient about their situation and prognosis, must have come to the conclusion together with the patient that there are no alternatives in the patient's situation to relieve the suffering. The physician must have consulted at least one other independent physician who must see the patient and give a written opinion on whether these criteria have been fulfilled. And while performing the act of euthanasia or assisting in suicide, the physician must have exercised due medical care and have paid attention to careful practices in this area. Then who are eligible for this practice? in principle, all persons who are at least 18 years old and are competent and making a voluntary request. For minors, there is a specific regulation. Minors may request euthanasia from the age of 12. And for minors aged 12 until 16, consent of parents is mandatory, while for minors aged 16 or 17, parental consent is not needed, but parents must be involved in the decision-making. And I immediately add to this that euthanasia or assisted suicide in minors is really very, very rare in our country. Further, the suffering must originate from a medical or psychiatric illness. This is not in the criteria themselves, but case law and review by the review committees, I will come back to that later, has demonstrated that that is how the law is interpreted. Suffering must originate from a specific illness. And the last important element in the law is that a patient must be competent to make a voluntary request, but in rare cases, an oral request can be replaced by a written request. And what that means is still debated today. It's a very complex element of the Dutch law, and perhaps we can discuss that later on. How then does it work when a physician considers administering euthanasia or assistance in suicide? As I already said, an important procedural safeguard before the act is that the physician must consult an independent second physician. And then when it is decided to perform the act, the physician is obliged to report the act to the municipal coroner and then and provide a report in which he describes why and how the act was performed. This report is then reviewed by a multidisciplinary committee, and that committee includes a physician, an ethicist, and a legal expert. And this committee gives a verdict, did or did the physician not adhere to the legal criteria. When the physician did adhere to the criteria, the case is closed. But when, according to the committee, the physician did not adhere to the legal criteria, cases are forwarded to the public prosecutor. And then the public prosecutor may decide to install a legal investigation. What do we know about current practices in this area? In principle, we have two important sources of information to follow the developments here. The first is the annual reports of the review committees. They are legally obligated to summarize the number of and characteristics of reported cases each year. And these reports also each year include exemplary judgments so that physicians can consult these reports when they doubt about whether or not providing assistance in dying is within the legal boundaries. The second important source of information, and perhaps even more important source of information, is the fact that the law is evaluated every 5 years by an independent scientific research team. And this research team looks at developments from a legal, a medical, as well as a societal perspective. And they perform legal investigations, empirical and epidemiological investigations, and also opinion polls, for example, among the general public. So what then? How then does the practice look like today? I added just a few exemplary slides to show you how this practice works in the Netherlands. First of all, I think it's very important to let you know that the euthanasia law in its current form is really widely supported by the general public. In 2015, we asked the general public, a representative sample of the general public, do you support the euthanasia law? 76% of the Dutch general public said, yes, I support it. And in principle, I would also consider euthanasia for myself. Another 12% supported the law, but said, yes, I support it, but not for myself. And then there was about 10 to 12% who do not support the law or who have no opinion on that. Further, it is also important that physicians in the Netherlands also widely support the current regulations and are also widely confronted with patients who request for euthanasia. For example, general practitioners indicate that 93% of them have ever received a request from one of their patients for either euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide, and 78% indicated that they have ever granted a request. So the large majority of GPs is involved in this practice. The percentages are a little bit lower for elderly care physicians, and that also has to do with the fact that euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide are typically not provided to patients in the highest age groups. The act is practiced there, but it's not most common in those high age groups. It's more common in patients aged 60 to 70. And it's also rarer in clinical specialists who are working in hospitals. And that has to do with the fact that patients who request euthanasia often prefer to spend their last trajectory in life at home. And then the GP is mostly the most important physician attending their care. You can see also here that the proportion of physicians who say, no, I would never grant a request for euthanasia or assistance in suicide is smallest among GPs. About a quarter of elderly care physicians say so, and about 1/3 of clinical specialists. This 1/3 among clinical specialists has mainly to do with the fact that clinical specialists say it is not a thing you should do in the hospital. It's better to do that at home in the patient's own home situation. So it's not a principled objection. It's more an objection of it's not for us, it's for the GP to be involved in this practice. This is a slide about the numbers, and here the numbers of euthanasia are presented as a percentage of all deaths in the Netherlands. The first investigation was done in 1990, and there you can see that and that was way before things were regulated from in a law, and already then we found that about 1.5% of all deaths were the result of euthanasia. And this percentage has increased over the years from 1990 to 2015, in which the latest investigation was done, to 4.5%. So we don't know how it is now and if it has further increased or not. But the latest investigation showed that about 4.5% of all deaths in the Netherlands are the result of euthanasia. When you express that in absolute numbers, it's somewhat over 6,000 cases per year. And this is the same slide, but then for physician-assisted suicide, where physicians provide the lethal medication, but the patient takes the lethal medication themselves. And you see that those percentages are much smaller and even have decreased over the years. It's not very clear for us researchers how that works, why this percentage decreases, because in principle, for example, the Royal Medical Association, that is the professional organization of doctors, favors physician-assisted suicide over euthanasia. But nevertheless, this percentage was in 2015 even smaller than it was in 1990. And that, of course, is also represented in the absolute numbers. Only about 150 cases of physician-assisted suicide in 2015. This should, of course, be 15. This slide shows you that not every patient who requests for euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide has his request granted. About 1/3 of all requests are granted. 2/3 of requests are not granted, and the main cause for that is that either the physician thinks that he cannot comply with the criteria of due care, or because the patient is already so far in his disease trajectory that there is no time to carefully proceed with the decision-making process. So the patient is already so far, so close to the death that the procedure cannot be carefully carried out. What then are the main characteristics of patients who receive euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide? In all the years, we have found that about 80% of the patients who get euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide have cancer, end-stage cancer. As I already explained, most patients are under 80 years of age. Their life expectancy is in most cases less than 1 month. So it's really mainly about patients who are already in a very late stage of their disease. And 90% of all cases is performed by GPs who are attending patients who are residing at home. And these characteristics have remained virtually the same over the years that we are studying this practice. The origin of suffering of patients receiving euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide, the very large majority is suffering from a somatic disease. A very small minority is suffering from a mental or psychiatric disease. A little bit more of the patients suffer from symptoms that are caused by older age-related illnesses, and that's mostly more than one illness, so it's deafness, blindness, all kinds of physical problems. In 3%, dementia plays a role, and the large majority of those cases involves dementia in an early stage where patients are still capable of making this competent request, voluntary request. And psychosocial or existential problems play a role in 3%, but I have to add that also in these cases, the origin of those psychosocial and existential problems is always some physical or mental illness. And this is my last slide about numbers. Here you can see the green bars represent the numbers that are reported to either the review committees. The review committees are there since 1998. And before that time, physicians had to report their act directly to the public prosecutor. And you can see that the number of reported cases has increased over the years. And in the red bars, you can see the number of cases we find in our research studies, and those numbers are highest. But the gap between cases we find in research and cases that are reported to the review committees has become smaller over the years. And nowadays, the gap between research-based numbers and reported cases-based numbers is mainly due to the fact that the cases that are not reported are in a sort of gray zone between what the so-called classical case of euthanasia is and the cases where you can doubt whether it's really euthanasia, cases in which, for example, high dosages of morphine or highly dosed palliative sedation is administered. And then you can doubt whether it really entails euthanasia. The doctor thinks not, but if you closely look at it, it might indeed be a case of euthanasia. So that explains mainly why not all cases are reported to the review committees nowadays. Well, then finally, some comments about the more general euthanasia debate in our countries. It, as I already explained, started already 50 years ago. And since that time, there have been several landmark court cases that have framed the criteria that are in the current law, the criteria for due care that are in the current law. It is important to be aware that during those 50 years, the medical professional and the medical professional organizations have been highly influential in this debate and have contributed much to the identification of the important safeguards, and that also resulted in a high degree of support from the medical profession for the current system. As I also showed you, there is much societal support. The large part of the general public supports this law, and also an important feature of the developments in the Netherlands that it has always been accompanied by an extensive body of empirical research. The basic principles underlying the Dutch euthanasia also serve as a framework for current debate, so I think it's important to mention them here. The basic principle that is underlying our Dutch law is the acknowledgement that a physician can, while following professional, ethical and medical standards, be in a conflict of duties. On the one hand, the duty to preserve life, and on the other, the duty to relieve suffering. And the law, as we have adopted it, is mainly to help physicians to resolve this conflict of duties. And that also means that assistance in dying is never considered a patient's right, and physicians are never obliged to grant a patient's request. They are always free to not comply with the request, also if they could, in theory, comply with all the safeguard criteria. And also an important principle is that in the Netherlands, transparency and public control are considered of the essence to have a safe and acceptable practice of physician assistance in dying. Current topics of debate are numerous, because I think adopting a law on euthanasia or physician assistance in suicide is not the end of debate, but much more the start of a debate. And important topics that are currently debated are, for example, should we be more clear about when and where patients with advanced dementia can receive assistance in dying? How about children? I showed you that there is a regulation for children of aged 12 years and over, but there is no regulation for children. There is also a regulation for newborn, but not for the children aged between 1 and 12. And if you would accept that those children can suffer unbearably, you could think, why is there not a regulation for this age category? There's also an important debate about persons who are tired of life, and as we call it, persons who feel their life is completed without having an underlying medical illness that explains why they feel their life is completed. There has recently been a parliamentary initiative to also develop a law for this group, but it's still under debate. Assistance in dying by non-physicians, it's much related to the previous topic, and also the legal position of the review committees is an important topic of debate, because it's not, the review committees are not officially providing legally valid judgments on whether physicians adhered to the legal criteria or not, and that involves a number of legal complexities that are also often debated. I think that was what I wanted to share with you about experiences in the Netherlands, and I'm happy now to give the floor back to Jocelyn to proceed with experiences from the other countries.
Thank you so much, Agnes, for an incredible presentation with important info. I wanted to jump in very quickly to mention a thank you to everyone submitting questions already, and just to make a quick comment that we will be addressing your questions later on in the session, about 15 minutes into the second hour, thereabouts roughly. So please stay tuned for responses to your questions, and thank you again. And I'll turn it back over to Jocelyn for her presentation.
Thanks, Sarah. So now we're going to look at the view from Canada, which you'll see has an asterisk. And that's because Quebec has its own law, as well as the being bound by the federal law. And I'm not going to talk about the Quebec situation in my prepared remarks, but I'm happy to take questions about it afterwards. If you have any, it's just a matter of time. I also need to note that this review of the view from Canada is current as of September 2020. It will be changing by December 2020. So I can only tell you what we are doing right now. Okay, so what are the key features of MAiD in Canada? Well, it's two types, as in the Netherlands. It's the administering by a medical practitioner or nurse practitioner of a substance to a person at their request that causes their death. It is also, though, the prescribing or providing by a medical practitioner or nurse practitioner of a substance to a person at their request so that they may self-administer the substance, and in doing so, cause their own death, otherwise commonly known as assisted suicide. Now, who can access MAiD? Well, anybody is eligible for health services funded by the government in Canada, or would be but for a minimum period of residence or a waiting period. So we have none of what is called suicide tourism. You have to be at least 18 years old. You have to be capable of making decisions with respect to your health. You have to have made a voluntary request, and you have to give informed consent to receive MAiD after having been informed of the means available to relieve suffering, including palliative care. And this last expression is expressly in the federal legislation. Now, you also have to have a grievous and irremediable medical condition. And this is defined in the legislation as follows. You have to have a serious and incurable illness, disease, or disability, be in an advanced state of irreversible decline in capability. The illness, disease, or disability, or the state of decline has to be causing enduring physical or psychological suffering that is intolerable to the person and that cannot be relieved under conditions that the person considers acceptable. And finally, their natural death has to have become reasonably foreseeable, taking into account all of their medical circumstances without a prognosis necessarily having been made as to the specific length of time that they have remaining. So there is no temporal proximity requirement in Canada. Now, this is in red font because this criterion will be gone by December because it's been found to be unconstitutional in the Quebec court decision of Truchon-Gladue, and the federal government has promised to remove it. Now, what are the key procedural safeguards? Well, 2 providers have to confirm that the eligibility criteria have been met to independent providers. And then there has to be a 10-day waiting period between the day the request is signed and the day MAiD is provided, unless there is an express exception, unless death or loss of capacity is imminent. And then you also have to have reconfirmation of consent immediately prior to the provision of MAiD. Now, the latter 2 bullets are in red. They get an asterisk too, because proposals to change them have been put to Parliament. And so we will know by December whether these changes are adopted. The changes include removing the waiting period if your natural death has become reasonably foreseeable, and allowing advance requests if you make your request after you have been found to meet all of the eligibility criteria. So we'll have to see whether those 2 procedural safeguards stay. Of particular comparative note relative to the other jurisdictions, including the United States, then I'd flag, we have both practitioner and self-administered MAiD. Physicians and nurse practitioners can be assessors and providers of MAiD. There is no requirement that somebody be terminally ill or at the end of life. The intolerability of suffering is subjective. It is for the person to determine. And there is no prior judicial review requirement for accessing MAiD. All right, what about our data? What's actually happening under this law? Well, the method of gathering is established by regulations, federal regulations, and the providers are required to submit a report to Health Canada or to their province or territory that then reports up federally. And practitioners have to report on all written requests, whether MAiD takes place or not. And they have to report on basic socio-demographic information about the person requesting MAiD. So, for example, age, gender, postal code. They have to report on the assessment of the request and whether the eligibility requirements were met. So they talk about the underlying medical condition and the description of suffering. They have to give information about the procedural safeguards if MAiD was provided. So, for example, the 10-day waiting period, that 2 practitioners confirmed eligibility, and so on. And then information about why the request may have gone unfulfilled, if in fact it did. So we gather that information. What do we find out when we gather it? Well, in terms of the number of cases, it's going up, as you can see, which is entirely to be expected, given that it just became legal. I anticipate it will continue to go up for a few years, but that it will level out somewhere around 4%. At the moment, it is 2% of all deaths in Canada. Then in terms of what condition people have, 67.2% have cancer, by far the most common underlying medical condition. You can see the nature of the suffering You can have more than one, and that's why these numbers add up to more than 100. But you will see that 82.1% report the nature of the suffering is from the loss of ability to engage in meaningful life activities, and 78.1% is the loss of ability to perform activities of daily living. The age, the most common age for people who access MAiD in Canada is 65 to 70. You see, last year it was 888 in that category. I would note that the average age is 75, and that people accessing MAiD are split pretty equally between men and women, with 51% men and 49% women. Now, how did we get here? Well, we got here through an iterative process. So we had litigation. That was individuals challenged the prohibition on MAiD that was present in our federal criminal code. And that case went all the way up to the Supreme Court of Canada, who did determine that the prohibition, the blanket prohibition on MAiD in Canada, violates the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, specifically the right to life and also the right to liberty and security of the person. So it was struck down. And then the federal government responded with what's known as C-14, it's just the number of the bill, in 2016. And it introduced a regulatory framework for MAiD. Noteworthy, Parliament narrowed the eligibility criteria from what we got from the Supreme Court of Canada to what was in C-14. And that's especially the introduction of this expression, natural death has become reasonably foreseeable. Within 10 days of the passage of that legislation, we were back in court, arguing that this narrowing, again, violated the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. There was a case in BC and a case in Quebec. The case in Quebec actually proceeded more quickly than BC, so the Truchon decision is the one that is now causing the further change to the law, because the Quebec court found that the narrowed eligibility criteria for MAiD that were in the federal legislation, in particular, natural death has become reasonably foreseeable, violates the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And the federal government, in response to the Truchon decision, promised to amend the law to make it constitutional. So as a result, our future directions are clear and they are upon us. Specifically, Bill C-7, the name for the new legislation, that has been introduced. There's a parliamentary technicality. It'll have to be reintroduced imminently. But Parliament has just resumed sitting, and so this is going to come up and very quickly, because there's a deadline of December of 2020, which is when the Truchon decision will take effect. So they need to get it done. Bill C-7, as proposed, will remove reasonably foreseeability as an eligibility criterion. It will allow some advance requests. So if you make the request in advance of loss of capacity, but after you've met all of the eligibility criteria, then a clinician can respect that. It excludes mental illness, and that's in quotes, that's the term they use, from the eligibility criterion of a serious and incurable illness, disease, or disability. So you can see the implication of that would be to exclude people with mental disorder as their sole underlying medical condition. So that is a significant proposed change. And also there are new procedural safeguards where natural death is not reasonably foreseeable. So natural death reasonably foreseeable is gone as an eligibility criteria, but it determines which procedural path you go down. So if you're reasonably foreseeable, for instance, you have no waiting period anymore. But if you are not yet reasonably foreseeable, you have a 90-day waiting period. So we'll see how those hold up. The other future direction, imminent future direction piece is the 5-year review. This was statutorily mandated in C-14. It was required that it start in June of 2020. However, because of COVID, like so many other things in our lives, it has been delayed. But the government should be establishing the committee very soon, and that committee will have to do a review of the implementation of C-14. How is the federal legislation working out for everyone? Has to do a review of the state of palliative care in Canada, and will be reviewing whether mature minors, so minors capable of understanding the nature and the consequence of the decision to access MAiD, whether mature minors should have access. They don't at the moment, should they? Advance requests, whether you should be able to make an advance request prior to meeting all of the eligibility criteria, for instance, so early dementia. And then how to respond when mental disorders are the sole underlying medical condition. So that's Canada in a nutshell. A lot has happened over the past few years, for sure, and we are going to have a very lively fall on this topic. So what I can end with is basically a plea that you just simply stay tuned because there's lots that's going to happen. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ben for a look at Australia.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jocelyn. And thanks to the Completed Life Initiative for the invitation to present the Australian perspective. I'm very pleased to be here. I should acknowledge that some of the work I'll present is done with a colleague, Lindy Wilmot, so I acknowledge that. And also I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, from which I'm presenting here today in Australia as well. So like the United States, Australia has a federal system of government. There's a federal or Commonwealth Parliament in Australia, and states as well, although life's a little easier in Australia with only 8 states and territories. And this is largely regulated at the state level. So I'll be talking about primarily Victoria, which passed a law in 2017 to permit voluntary assisted dying. That's the term that's used in Australia. It didn't start for 18 months. There was a planned implementation period. So that law has been in force since June of 2019. So that'll be the focus of today. But I should note there are other laws which have been passed and likely to be on the way. So another Australian state, Western Australia, passed a law in 2019, which will come into force again in the middle of 2021. So there's a second law which will be operative this time next year. There's also other bills before Parliament in Tasmania, and there's also one in Queensland which a parliamentary committee has recommended reform should occur. So there is plenty going on in Australia, but I will focus on the one state which is operative at the moment, and that's Victoria. In terms of the key features, thinking about what constitutes voluntary assisted dying, and it's similar to what we've heard to date in the Netherlands and Canada. It covers both what the Victorian legislation calls self-administration, where the person takes the medication themselves, and practitioner administration, where a medical practitioner administers medication to the person. But what's of interest or a little bit different about Victoria is there is a legislative default for self-administration. Practitioner administration is only permitted in certain circumstances, namely when the person's physically incapable of self-administering or digesting the medication. So both are permitted, but one is only available in those limited circumstances. In terms of accessing voluntary assisted dying, thinking first about the non-medical conditions or criteria, there's a requirement to be 18 years or more, and there's both citizenship and residence requirements as well. Of note to mention is that there are 2 ordinarily resident Victoria dot points on this slide. That isn't a typo. One of the things that I'll touch on is in the course of this presentation is some of the politics that was needed for the law to pass, and that additional bullet point not only being ordinarily resident in Victoria, but also ordinarily resident in Victoria for 12 months prior to that first request was part of the political compromise required for the law to pass. And of course, decision-making capacity as well in relation to voluntary assisted dying. I should mention that criteria relating to voluntariness and the enduring nature of the request aren't actually part of the eligibility criteria, but this doesn't mean they're not present during the process. They are required to be tested at a number of points during the procedural steps of the legislation. Thinking about the medical aspects of the criteria, an incurable, disease, illness or medical condition that's incurable, it must be advanced, progressive and will cause death. There's a requirement that death be expected in a period not exceeding 6 months. And again, one of those interesting idiosyncratic Victorian aspects is that is not 6 months for particular conditions. It's actually 12 months if your illness is neurodegenerative. And there's also a requirement that the illness or condition is causing suffering that person considers can't be relieved in a manner that's tolerable to them. Similar to some of the discussion that Jocelyn was talking about before, there are specific exclusions about the basis or the types of illness that can provide access for voluntary assisted dying in Victoria. Both mental illness and disability are not capable of providing a basis for accessing voluntary assisted dying. Now, this doesn't mean that if a person has mental illness or if a person has a disability, they are precluded from accessing voluntary assisted dying, provided they meet all the other criteria. It's just that they're not eligible on the basis of that alone. Some noteworthy procedural safeguards, and I should note this is the short version. I'm expecting a few brickbats coming the way of Victoria in terms of the discussion that will follow about the way in which the procedural safeguards are put together under this legislation. There are 68. And the words safest and most conservative legislation in the world were repeatedly said by the Victorian Premier, our lead politician, and a number of members of the government and others when talking and debating about this bill. It's one of the aspects that's really emphasised. And it is a very significant body of legislation. It's 134 pages with many 68 safeguards. So I've just flagged a few here, which we might discuss in the time that follows. One that's significant and different from other places is there is a prohibition on health practitioners raising voluntary assisted dying. So a doctor, for example, seeing a patient who would be eligible is not able to raise this option, this lawful option with patients. Like elsewhere, other jurisdictions we've seen, there are 2 eligibility assessments. One of those medical practitioners must be a specialist in the illness and both must have done mandatory training. There's timing in terms of a first request must be at least 9 days after the first request, except if they're likely to die first. The last 2 bullet points deal with reporting processes, which are, again, contribute to those procedural safeguards, but are a little bit different from some other regimes. There's a requirement for doctors to report to the Voluntary Assisted Dying Review Board, which is the oversight body, at each step along the process. So, for example, there's a form when the first assessment is done and whether the patient's eligible or not. That form has to be sent to the review board. Likewise, for the second assessment, a form has to be completed and sent into the Voluntary Assisted Dying Review Board during that process. And the other aspect of prospective review is that there is a requirement to receive a VAD permit from the government. So having been assessed as eligible to receive voluntary assisted dying and all the various processes gone through, the doctor who's coordinating the process actually has to apply to the government for a permit before voluntary assisted dying can be provided. So we are thinking about comparative aspects, and I guess some things to flag for discussion or debate later on about why Victoria is different or noteworthy perhaps. So it's generally a narrow or conservative model in terms of, and you would have seen that some of that with the eligibility, but also those procedural safeguards. There is a required expected time until death, and of note is it's not always 6 months, it's generally 6 months, but 12 months for a neurodegenerative disease. Are highly focused on procedures and safeguards. It is 134 pages, an act that goes for 134 pages, which is quite different from a number of other models. And I mentioned the prospective permit from government and that prohibition on raising the topic of voluntary assisted dying. And I guess another feature which is different is the idea that both self-administration and practitioner administration are permitted. But there is this legislated default for self-administration. Practitioner administration is expected to be the exception only if it's not possible for self-administration to be provided. So thinking about data, so some qualifications are important here. We only have just over 1 year of data for which the system has been working. And the reporting to date has been relatively limited. And the VAD Review Board, who has as that oversight responsibility I mentioned, has cited privacy issues for reporting data at a relatively high level. But the data I'll be talking about today is from the latest VAD Review Board.
Hi, everyone. So sorry for the glitch. I think Ben temporarily lost connection and was kicked off, and he has resumed. I see him back. So apologies for the delay. And Jocelyn, if you are ready to offer a few comments, we welcome your comments. Otherwise, Ben, we'll resume with you.
If Ben's there, I'd just have him carry on. I can't see.
I think he disappeared again, unfortunately. So, I would love to turn it back over to you.
Sure. Well, let's go to his slides and see where we're at. Okay, so he's reporting on the various aspects of why people are seeking voluntary assisted dying. I think he had just gotten through that. So let's carry on and see what we've got. Okay, so the path to law reform in Australia has been complicated, no doubt, because of the fact that it's got a federal system and state system. Interestingly, criminal law is state-based in Australia, as it is in the United States, unlike Canada, which is federal, so it's actually harder for them to change in some ways. And so, as people may know, euthanasia started in Australia really with the Northern Territory, which went ahead and introduced some legislation in 1995. Now, because of the particular status of the territory, as opposed to it being a state, they couldn't have done this to a state, but they were able, the federal government took it away. They repealed and removed the legislative power. And so euthanasia had a very quick window of existence in Australia and then stopped. And then there were many attempts in different Australian states to try and get legislation. And then finally, Victoria passed its legislation. So they became the first to have euthanasia legislation VAD. And it came about as a result of the bipartisan parliamentary committee, which together recommended the VAD reform. And then they had a ministerial advisory panel which designed the law. So you had the committee recommend it, then you had the design of the law, and then after a lot of debate and discussion, Parliament passed the legislation. And Ben could talk about at great length about the political navigation that was required in order to pass this legislation. And that navigation, negotiation, is partly why they have so many procedural safeguards, as he mentioned it, because amendments were needed in the upper house in order to get it passed, and those amendments tended to just shut it down. So, and as he mentioned before, there was an 18-month implementation period, and that has passed. So in terms of the future directions in Australia, they have in Victoria required, as we did in Canada, modeling on the Netherlands, I would say, is a review is to be conducted in the 5th year of what happened in the first 4 years. And then they're doing ongoing work on the implementation. And this is particularly critical, as he says here, given the complexity of the system, because of all the different procedural safeguards in particular, it is much trickier to make it work than the path that was taken in the Netherlands, in fact, many American states and in Canada. In Western Australia, they are in the implementation phase. So they have passed the legislation, and they are due to start in mid-2021. And then the other states are contemplating it. So Queensland, Tasmania, literally this week have been debating in Parliament about a bill introduced by Senator Michael Gaffney. So keep an eye on that, because that's truly imminent. And then South Australia is also in the mix. Generally, they are looking at Victoria as the quote unquote default model. So, and as happened in the United States, for instance, you get one and that one tends to be replicated. So it'll be interesting to see if the other states are as restrictive as Victoria is, or whether somebody breaks free. And I would recommend you could have a look at the Tasmania legislation, because I think they are breaking free more than we are seeing the other states break free. Maybe it's a function of Tasmania being a little island off the coast of a great big continent, but they maybe are feeling a bit more independent, shall we say. So those are the future directions that they are engaged upon. They're going to be going. And now what we'll do is we'll just switch to now reflect a little bit on, we said we promised at the beginning we do some bouquets and brickbats. The idea being there that we'll each sort of tell a compliment and a criticism of each of the other jurisdictions to perhaps highlight the differences, and also to give us a moment to sort of stir things up and tease each other, because you will see there's a standard tease that goes against the Australians for what happened in Victoria, and that'll come up in my bouquets and brickbats. So at this point, we're going to switch over to, we'll go over to Agnes, and she'll do relative to the Netherlands. Then I'll do Canada, and if Ben's not back, I will channel Ben again for the bouquets and brickbats from Australia.
Okay, thank you, Jocelyn. Well, as an epidemiologist, I'm not very used to be very opinionated on regulations and practices in other countries, but since I was asked to do so, and I, of course, do have some opinions on what happens in other countries, I'm happy to do so now. I think the common feature in those other jurisdictions as compared to the Netherlands is that the Netherlands really has an abundance of data about practices regarding end-of-life decision-making, not only about euthanasia and physician assistance in suicide, but also about other practices in that stage of life. And I think that has been very illustrative of and very helpful in understanding the practice of physician assistance in dying, and also in further discussing where the system is working well and where the system might be improved. So I think, and on the other hand, I must also immediately acknowledge that having an abundance of data also makes us sort of vulnerable as a country, because it also shows where the problems may be and where the system suffers from weaknesses. So having an abundance of data is not for a country not only an advantage, but may also sometimes make things complex. For the rest, I think, well, when it compares to Canada, I think that and I've experienced that myself, being a member of one of the expert panels that provided an advice on knowledge and information on several specific topics that were also discussed by Canada, shows that the Canadian system is very willing to consider weaknesses and opportunities for improvement, and that's also resulted in some plans to improve the system right away. On the other hand, I think for Canada, a brickbat may be the 10-day waiting period. In my experience and the experience of the Dutch practice, I think when there has already been a very careful decision-making process that ends up in deciding, yes, this is the way to proceed for this patient, I think a 10-day waiting period can make things more complex instead of making the procedure more safe and secure. And as for Australia, I think, well, the very detailed safeguards that were already discussed are, on the one hand, I think, providing physicians with a very clear set of requirements they have to fulfill and very clear picture of where they have to go. But on the other hand, the number of safeguards is so many that it may also make things more complex. Finally, as far as the USA concerns, that's actually the other way around. The safeguards there are quite straightforward and simple, which also, I think, results in a rather limited practice. You may consider that a bouquet on the one hand, but also a brickbat on the other. For example, regarding the fact that only self-administered death is allowed in most USA states that allow this practice. And whereas we know from the Netherlands that self-administered death may involve more complexities than death that is administered by a physician, that I think could also entail complexities. Well, that's my contribution here, I think.
Super. Okay, so I'll jump in with some bouquets and brickbats coming from Astrid in Canada. So first, with respect to the Netherlands, the bouquet is that the focus in the Dutch approach is on autonomy and suffering, and not on the condition that the person has or how much time they have left. So they don't talk in terms of terminality or reasonably foreseeable natural death and so on. And so that has saved them from many of the pitfalls that others experience. And I think that's the real strength of their program. A brickbat would be that the assessment of suffering in the Netherlands is not entirely subjective, and the physician must agree. And I don't find that conceptually, philosophically defensible. So I'm glad ours didn't go down that path. With respect to Australia, the bouquet is that it is a subjective assessment of suffering, and what cannot be relieved, the suffering cannot be relieved, is relative to measures that are acceptable to the person. So it isn't just the fact that there's some treatment out there that maybe it has side effects that you just can't tolerate, but because it's there, you don't qualify because you'd say it can be relieved. So it is attached to what is acceptable to the person. The brickbat is that access is restricted to people who are 6 or 12 months. Prognosis, as you heard from Ben, and I'm glad we didn't go down that path. 7,165 procedural safeguards in the Victoria legislation. That's what I mentioned. What we're teasing Ben about this because Victoria is just so extraordinarily restrictive, and I do think it's actually really problematic and actually can't, in fact, be defended from a philosophical perspective. And then relative to the United States, I'd say the bouquet I wanted to put into the ether of the conversation that we have during the rest of the session is that your law reform has come through referendum, through propositions. It's in a sense a form of direct democracy, and there's a way in which that saves the incredible amount of time and energy and money of going to court, changing your law through litigation, and also legislative processes which are vulnerable to the power of single-issue voters and not the will of the majority. So it's an interesting contrast to get your law reform that way. And then for the brickbats, I would say a concern is that it is only self-administered, which really restricts access to a number of people who I think should have access. And also the eligibility is dependent on the predicted proximity to death, that the terminal illness, the 6 months and so on. So with that, we'll send it over to Australia to get his own back.
Thanks, Jocelyn, and apologies, folks, for dropping out. I think maybe internet providers think 3 a.m. is a good time to do some testing here in Australia, so my apologies for that. So in terms of thinking about the bouquet for the Netherlands, the transparency in the system, we mentioned, Agnes has mentioned some of the government-supported research, which of course is important, but in particular I wanted to point out the very public reporting that the various euthanasia review committees do, including those anonymised cases, which enable people from all around the world, it's published in English as well, to see how the system works. So I think that's a real strength of the Netherlands. I would love to see Australia adopt in its practice and implementation as we move forward. Perhaps the brickbat is one of them is a gap between law and practice for advance requests. So that's possible under the Dutch law, but in practice, the evidence suggests operationalising that has been challenging. So I guess as a lawyer, I'm interested in that when rights exist in law, or when opportunities exist in law, that it's possible for them to be operationalised. And I think that's one of the challenges there. In terms of thinking about Canada, the bouquet is that a global assessment is taken in terms of the decline in a person's capability. One of the challenges I think that we have in Australia is that there's a requirement for this medical condition to qualify, and that has to cause death. But there isn't really scope. The way life works is that someone may well have 3 or 4 conditions, all of which that constellation of conditions may mean they're likely to die within 6 months. But because they can't point to a single condition, it's done in relation to individual conditions, they may not be eligible. Whereas that Canadian global assessment of the person, I think, better reflects what we should be trying to do with the law. The brickbat here is uncertainty. And I mentioned in particular eligibility criteria. Natural death is reasonably foreseeable. I think it would have to be that the lead candidate for some concerns in terms of really being clear on what this means and how that works in relation to different illnesses. One of the illustrations of this is Jocelyn with colleagues has written a mountain of paper, literally trying to understand, well, what does this eligibility criteria mean? And there's been some inconsistent statements from official sources in parliamentary debates, in government materials about what that might mean. So I think that presents a challenge for individuals, for people seeking MAiD and practitioners as well. Thinking about the United States, the bouquet is that if you're going to choose a narrow model, so I guess one of the things that Australia and the US have in common is that they are relatively restricted narrow models. But the bouquet for the US is that it hasn't gone down that path of having an undue bureaucratic process for accessing voluntary assisted dying. And the brickbat here is that only self-administration is permitted. I think that's already been discussed, and I think that's one of the challenges for the US law.
Great. Thank you all so much for an incredible back and forth and your presentations as well. The bouquets and brickbats is a nice touch, so thank you for introducing us to that. And the comparison between the Netherlands, Australia, and the US and Canada is very insightful. So thank you so much. I wanted to offer a quick note around CLE and CME credits. For those of you who are seeking CLE credit, please note that the first participation code is capital MAiD for MAiD. At the end of the program, I will give the second code. And also, if you are seeking CLE credit, we have the QR code available. Or I'm sorry, the CME credit. We have the QR code available. So please send us an email or visit our website, completedlife.org, or our email at info@completedlife.org. So without further ado, I will start going through your questions. So first question is for Agnes from David Hoffman. It's, does the illness requirement exclude injury, such as spinal cord injury, as a justified motivation for medical aid in dying? Agnes, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, it doesn't exclude injury. Injury is all causing considerable suffering, is also considered as making patients eligible for this practice. So it's not excluded injury.
Thank you. Another question from Kirk Allison is, in the Netherlands, Canada, and Australia, what is listed as cause of death and manner of death on the death certificate in cases of death by euthanasia or assisted suicide?
Can I start?
Absolutely.
In the Netherlands, in case of euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, both the underlying cause of suffering that would have resulted in death if the patient would not have died from euthanasia, as well as euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide, are registered. So we know from the death certificate registry what the underlying cause of the death was.
In Canada, it's a little bit variable. In part, that's because we have only voluntary guidelines at the federal level. The medical certificates of death are managed at a provincial territorial level, and there's a bit of variability. There are voluntary guidelines, though, and I believe that the desire is to have the underlying cause be represented as, for instance, cancer, if you're one of the many people who seek MAiD because of the cancer. And then you talk about antecedent causes, and that's where you track back into the drugs that are used. And under manner, you may find the manner be MAiD, which is what I would advocate is the way it should be reported. But also you find natural in some places. One thing I want to flag for people is this, because I saw the question and people think about this, it sometimes suggests that this is, falsifying records to say that you died of cancer when you died of MAiD, for instance. But I think it's really important to understand what the purpose of medical certificates of death purposes are, and that this is not in fact falsification, and there's a very good public policy reason for reporting it this way, for instance, which is to say cancer was the underlying cause, because these certificates feed into your vital statistics, and the vital statistics feed into your public policy decision making about where you're going to spend your money. So for instance, if you suddenly had a precipitous drop in the number of cancer cases, of death because of cancer, you would shift your funding, your healthcare funding, away from cancer. And yet that would be completely wrong, because it's cancer that's causing people to want the MAiD. And so that's why our system has advanced in this way, is that the voluntary guidelines, which are the gold standard that I hope we will all move to, are driven by a desire for transparency, which you get by having MAiD as the manner of death, but you have the underlying condition as your underlying cause, and therefore you don't skew your public policy decision making.
And in Victoria, a cause of death is underlying cause as well, but there is also a separate record made that someone has received voluntary assisted dying.
Great, thank you all. So a separate question is from Stephanie Green, who asks about kind of the ethical review of an appointment of individuals. For example, who makes up the independent scientific research team that does the evaluation every 5 years? How are they appointed? By whom? Are they government employees? Does this change every 5 years? And do they have power to make any recommendations? So your thoughts.
Well, in the Netherlands, every 5 years there is a call for research groups who want to apply for performing this review. And it has been performed 3 times now. And of course, the number, Netherlands is a small country, and the number of groups who are interested in performing this review is not that big, because they need expertise in both the legal, the ethical, the medical aspects of this review system and the law. And until now, I have been involved in every of those review studies. But it's each and again, every time it is reviewed, and the best group with the best proposal is selected. So it's really an independent group. It's not connected to the government. It's not government employees or whatever. So it's really an independent scientific group who also is free to perform the research and provide the recommendations they want. It's not decided by the government or influenced by the government what recommendations we can make. So it's really an independent review of a group of scientific experts.
Great, thank you so much. So I want to turn to Ben and ask about Australia. Ashley Sweet asks, can you speak to the special training required for physicians providing VAD in Australia?
Yes, of course. And this is one of the safeguards in the legislation, and is a novel feature, I believe. So the 2 doctors who are involved in assessing eligibility, before they're able to do that, they're required to undertake what's called approved training. And it's a training program which is effectively have to be approved by the state, and it was designed in consultation with them. With my colleague Lindy Wilmot and others, we designed and prepared that training. It's basically about 6 hours of online training, and the goal is to make sure that all the legislative requirements of the Act, because as discussed, it is very complex, doctors can understand and know that process and be stepped through that. So one of the upsides of a model like that is that there is this sort of required baseline level of understanding that all doctors involved in assessing eligibility will have. The downside is that doctors have to do that before being involved, and there were initial concerns about whether that may cause barriers. But over time, I think a number of doctors have now undertaken that training, so the pool of eligible doctors is growing over time. There's assessment at the end. There's a requirement with a 90% pass rate, so it is quite rigorous in terms of getting through. But the goal there was to have confidence that all doctors involved in voluntary assisted dying would have that baseline understanding of what the law said.
Great, thank you, Ben. And now I want to turn to a question by, and forgive me if I mispronounce your name, Ravathi A. Davidson. His question, is the cost of medication paid for by the government, or is it all out-of-pocket costs for the individual in Canada, Australia, and the Netherlands? Your thoughts?
In the Netherlands, it's paid by health insurance companies, so it's not out of pocket. It's paid by it's within the costs that are covered by health insurance.
It's covered for us too. I would notice there's a really stark difference too in the cost of the drug for self-administration in Canada between Canada and the United States, which is typical of so many drugs, the situation with respect to so many drugs. Ours, secobarbital is not actually licensed, so it gets compounded and it doesn't cost very much at all, whereas the drug company took it over in the United States, as I understand it, and just shot the price way up. So the price of the drugs is not a barrier to access for Canadians.
And likewise in Victoria, there's a government program to cover costs of voluntary assisted dying to support patients wanting to seek that.
So this seems like a glaring error in terms of U.S. policy, where if a physician issues a prescription to a patient and the patient goes to a pharmacy to get it filled, not only is the prescription generally not covered by insurance, but the pharmacist has the right of refusal for that prescription as well. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to how your respective countries handled this concern of right of refusal and how that works.
Let's start with Australia first this time.
Sure. So there's a right of conscientious objection, which is embedded across for all health practitioners in the legislation. Look, I think one of the challenges in the Victorian law is that there's a single, I mean, despite being 134 pages and things dealt with in excruciating detail, there is just one single statement about conscientious objection which creates a right. There's no provisions which deal with, for example, duties to refer, and there's no other provisions that deal with sort of wider considerations of conscience too, like about how facilities should manage these sorts of things. So there's that clear statement that all health practitioners of all types have that right, but how that's operationalised in practice has been left to codes of practice, informal conduct, and so on.
I'll jump in. Our federal legislation is silent on this because it's actually a matter for provinces and territories in our division of powers as between these levels of government. But we very clearly have on clinicians duty of effective transfer of care or duty of effective referral that comes from the colleges of physicians and surgeons and the nurse practitioners. As regards pharmacists, the way that is resolved is that the store itself has an obligation to ensure that somebody is on duty who can provide the meds. And that's the theory. In practice, sometimes I suspect there are some barriers, but that is the way that conscience is respected for a pharmacist. But the burden of respecting the conscience is not placed on the patient, it's placed on the store. So the store manager has to ensure they always have somebody on duty who would be able to provide. And this ground was trod earlier because of Plan B and issues around access to contraceptive and emergency abortifacients in Canada. And so that's how that's established now.
Yes, and then in the Netherlands, actually this topic has never been extensively debated. In the Netherlands, the physician is the only one who can get the medication and hand it over to the patient. So it's not the patient himself or herself who has to go to the pharmacist. It's the doctor who gets the medication and provides it to the patient. And I think in principle, pharmacists are allowed to object and not to cooperate, but I've never heard of that entailing a problem. I don't think it is a problem in practice in our country. I've never heard of it, so.
So that perspective invaluable. Thank you so much.
And can I just add to that, because we allow self-administered, but it's a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage of the cases. So it's almost entirely provider administered, and the physicians don't pick up the drugs. They get a drug kit.
Mm-hmm. So typically, what is the timeline from first request to administration of the dose or fulfilling of the prescription?
Well, that highly varies because it also depends on what you consider the first request. In many cases, there has been already a discussion of years where the option of euthanasia was discussed and first considered, and then when the time's there, we will come back to it, etc. So in many cases, it's years, but in other cases, it's only weeks. For example, especially in the hospital, the procedure often takes less time, but I would say the minimum time frame is about 2 weeks. And the maximum time frame is obviously years, but it's highly varying and dependent on the situation and the nature of the discussion and whether or not the patient and the physician need time to consider the criteria, etc. So it's really depends on the situation.
Yeah, we depend enormously too. I would say our outer ends are years, as you say, because some people will start really detailed conversations and then not want it. Sometimes the length of time is a function of not having access to a provider, that is problematic. Our shorter limit would be shorter than what Agnes was describing, in the sense that you can waive the 10-day waiting period, and that does get waived a lot because if you're imminently dying or imminent loss of capacity, and so it can be as short as a day. That's rare, but it can be.
So in Victoria, we've only got very limited data, as you would have seen. There is some reporting on periods from first request to final request. I think 50% occur within 19 days. But of course, that doesn't capture a lot of the challenges at the beginning of the process, before that sort of official first request starts. There isn't sort of detailed empirical research yet on Victoria, as you'd expect, given the timing. But the anecdotal evidence that exists says that folks are having difficulty, I guess, starting the process. And also at the end, so even after the final request has been made, there's still that requirement to go off and get a permit. There's then a requirement to get the medication dispensed. There's a statewide pharmacy in Victoria, which actually has carriage of doing this. And I understand they're working very hard, but there's some challenges in terms of timeliness there as well. So I think that the processes that we have in Victoria and all those safeguards, I think that time is something which people are reporting is a barrier and a challenge for people accessing assisted dying. Some folks are saying that they're getting well into months into the process and either lose capacity or lose the ability to persist. So a challenge for Victoria, but more research is needed on that.
Thank you all. So you've mentioned, a terminal illness or significant suffering as reason and cause for seeking assistance in dying. And so we've had a couple of questions looking at the other end of that concern, where has legislation or your policy in respect for countries considered evaluated people who are just simply tired of life for medical aid in dying? Agnes mentioned briefly in the current bill before Parliament about people just, panel's thoughts on just people being helped to die at request for any reason, like I mentioned, being tired of life. And this question comes from Lewis Cohen and reiterated by Timothy Quill, specifically looking at just suffering that is predominantly psychic or psychiatric. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, mental or psychiatric illness is among the conditions that qualify in principle for assistance in dying. So also if it's exclusively mental or psychiatric illness, there's no physical component needed. And I think the Netherlands is different in that respect from the other jurisdictions discussed here. And as I showed, in practice, psychiatric or mental illness as the sole cause of suffering qualifying for euthanasia is quite rare. It's not very common, and also in many cases controversial. But it's accepted, and it is possible. It is of course the real exception, because also psychiatrists indicate in our research that they are very reluctant here, and that they feel that it's very difficult to judge whether or not there are really no alternatives for relieving the suffering, and whether or not really everything has been tried to help the patient. So that's really difficult. But there are cases, and I also saw a question, what type of conditions then qualify? And I would suggest, well, in principle, any type of psychiatric suffering. There have been cases of, for example, depression, severe depression. There have been cases of psychotic disease, of personality disorders. There has been a case of a patient who suffered unbearably from a noise in the ear. I don't know the appropriate medical word right now, but that has so the variety in those patients is there. But in principle, there is no limitation to the nature of the psychiatric or mental suffering. Because, well, unbearable suffering is considered it can originate from mental suffering, and there's no limitation there. And when it comes to completed life, being tired of life, that is, from a legal point of view, not allowed. And the reason for that is that the system is very much embedded in the medical domain. And physicians are not considered to be the professionals who should resolve suffering that is not originating from a medical problem. They are not experts in assessing or helping people with problems that do not originate from medical or mental disorders. And that is why those people are excluded. There have been discussions whether or not a separate law or separate regulation should be initiated for those groups. But until now, that has not been done. And that's primarily because the current system that is embedded in the medical domain is considered to work quite well. Wide support, very few violations of the criteria. And there is much concern that if you would have a system parallel to the current medical system, that would really be a threat to the current system, because then patients who are not having their request granted from the medical domain could turn to the other system and then say, well, then I'm tired of life and I want it from the other systems. And that could really seriously damage the relationship of the physician with the patient, who is discussing whether or not it's a good option, and could really damage the safety for physicians who are really base their considerations on the current criteria. So that would really be a very big problem for the current system. So that is why that is not. It is still debated, and as I said, there is a proposal from Parliament to regulate it, but I don't expect that it will be accepted at short notice in our country.
I'll jump in. So first, in respect of tired of life, that is not permitted in Canada. You wouldn't fit with the serious and incurable illness, disease, or disability, and advanced state of declining capability. But one or other of those have to be the cause of the suffering. So under the current law, it's definitely not there. I would say there isn't a significant move to get it. I don't think that there would be a path to it, because your pathways are going to be litigation, and I think you'd have a hard time winning on that because of the arguments that would be made with respect to procedural safeguards and so on. And then through Parliament, you're just never going to get that through our parliament to introduce that kind of an expansion. We're just working on what we have now, get it right, and it's grounded in conceptions of responding to suffering and autonomy, with then put on the other side this language of protection of those who are vulnerable to abuse and neglect. So this wouldn't fit in there. On the psychiatric illnesses, it's important to note that in Canada, in fact, mental disorders with sole underlying medical condition is not expressly excluded under the legislation as it is now. You just tend not to qualify because you tend not to meet reasonably foreseeable. But you can meet reasonably foreseeable, as, for example, with anorexia. And we've had cases of anorexia. So, but it's very, very rare. So there's a lot of pressure to deal with that. And because reasonably foreseeable will be gone as an eligibility criterion by December of this year, you can see how that will open it up to persons with mental disorders as their sole underlying condition. So there will be an enormous debate about that this fall. This is partly why they put in place the provision mental illness does not constitute a serious and incurable illness for the purposes of eligibility into the proposed revisions to the law, is it's a holding piece, right? It's that they couldn't figure out what to do with mental disorders and in time for the legislation to go through Parliament. So I think, this is my speculation, they put it in to say, okay, well, let's exclude it, because they I think inadvertently allowed it before. They didn't realize they hadn't blocked it. So they put it in, and then they're going to have, as part of the review, the 5-year review, they're going to explore what do we do with mental disorders as a sole underlying medical condition, and then see what they do, whether they take that clause out or and regulate it in another way. I don't know. That clause itself, I don't think would survive a charter challenge. I tell my students I use the exam test, which is, if I would not put this question in an exam because it would be too easy to answer that it is unconstitutional, then you probably shouldn't put that provision in draft legislation. And that's what this piece of our proposed legislation is. It's just so straightforwardly, I think, a breach of the charter and would be challenged right away if it does go through. So bottom line, you can have access to MAiD with a mental disorder straight up if you're reasonably foreseeable. Many more will by December be able to have access. And another thing that's really important for people to understand in the context of this debate is, of course, there's mental disorder with comorbidities, and none of that's excluded. And all of the complexity that's associated with some mental disorders, irremediability, incurability, how do you assess capacity, that kind of thing, that all applies in the context of somebody who has a comorbidity. And that's already allowed. So rather than getting into debates about what should be included, excluded, how do we cut things out, what I think we should do, and a number of people in Canada are doing, is wrestling with what are these complexities and how can we manage them in the context of the physician or nurse practitioner relationship to ensure that what we're trying to achieve with legislation is actually achieved, and not set ourselves up for some peculiar incoherence that's associated with, like, I have a person, the exact same psychiatric condition, they appear not to qualify, and then one person gets a diagnosis of diabetes. All of a sudden, one gets it and one doesn't. That illustrates the problem, right? So it is not to deny the complexity, but it is to say it is not only mental illness that has that complexity, and not all mental illness has that complexity. So we need to deal with it differently. So we will be trying to deal with this in Canada.
Can I ask you a question, Jocelyn? Yeah. Do you know how Canadian psychiatrists, what the position of Canadian psychiatrists is?
Yeah, it's quite interesting because there are some very, very vocal opponents. There is much more support than you would think amongst the psychiatrists in some surveys that have been done. Not sure they've all been released. But I know from talking to some of them, they're actually scared to express their support for it. But the Canadian Psychiatric Association does not take a position of opposition to MAiD. There's internal strife within that association. And there are psychiatrists who are MAiD assessors and providers not necessarily wouldn't be for psychiatric illness, but they are providers. I think it's almost 2%. So they're split. They are less in support of MAiD than the general public, because the general public is, vast majority. But the numbers are surprisingly strong, and so it could be like sort of any other profession where people you don't have to provide, but there will be providers.
So just quickly in Victoria, I mean, the complexity that Jocelyn mentioned, that's just sort of swept pretty much aside by a simple, blunt statement that access on the basis of mental illness is not possible in Victoria. That's, I guess, the type of provision that Jocelyn foreshadowed may be introduced potentially in Canada. That's in place in Victoria, so that's specifically excluded. And for a jurisdiction that sort of has put its hand up as the safest and most conservative in the world, I don't think Tide of Life will be even seriously contemplated. The reason the legislation in Victoria is so narrow is that was what was required for it to pass. Indeed, that we've got 2 houses of parliament in Victoria. The bill passed the lower house in a very, very narrow form, but it wasn't narrow enough, and further changes, further safeguards were required when it went through the upper house. So the prospect of sort of widening to consider issues of Tide of Life, I think, are remote.
Great, thank you so much. So kind of a correlated question from Anne Fenton Hathaway, wondering about, Jocelyn, your expectation that the percentage of deaths that will be due to medical aid in dying as time passes, currently at 2%, as you mentioned, but you expect it to land around 4% in Canada as of like 2015. Is there any percentage that would be concerning to you, say if it continues to increase but doesn't stop or plateau around 4%, either because it would indicate widespread suffering, or because it would kind of indicate more vulnerable or populations taking advantage of the law, or some other reason? What are your thoughts?
All right, so I'd say there isn't a total number or a percentage that in the abstract is of concern, because if people qualify, and we've decided that as a society, this is the group that should qualify, then whatever percent qualifies should have access, with the caveat that you do want to be sure that it's not because people either don't have access to, they would like, but don't have access to some kinds of other, to other alternatives and so on. So you always want to be looking at what are the reasons. Does everybody meet the eligibility criteria? Do they meet the procedural safeguards? Have they had alternatives made available to them? Although flag there, not alternatives that don't exist, right? So we expressly looked at the issue of, people made the argument, if you don't have enough palliative care, then you shouldn't have MAiD. And the trial judge in the Carter decision actually looked at that expressly, and to paraphrase, said, you don't hold people hostage for social change. You can't say, well, you have to wait in a state of total suffering, intolerable suffering, until society manages to get palliative care for everyone. And also the numbers of palliative care are very, very high. People having access to palliative care in the face of a request for MAiD. So I think it is a function of the system working well, everybody taking very seriously the eligibility criteria and the procedural safeguards, and ensuring that people are offered as much as they can be. So I can't say a number. The reason I landed where I did around 4 is in part because you look at the Netherlands and they're between 4 and 5, and they have been doing it for a very long time, and have a more similar regime to ours than the United States. Because if you, and I don't think Australia will get this high either, because they don't have provider administered, and the numbers of self-administered are so low. And I think that does make a big difference.
We've actually just Oh, sorry, Agnes.
No, I wanted to add, of course, what constitutes unbearable or severe suffering may change over time. And especially because in Canada, this is completely subjective assessment that may, well, develop into a direction you would not want it to develop into. So, and that is not one-on-one related to the number of cases, of course, but that may be a problem in the future. That the tolerance of suffering diminishes, and assistance in dying may become more the default instead of the exception.
I guess I would say to that, I doubt that will happen, in part because it is tied to the condition or the decline, for one thing. And because clinicians can decline to provide. They have to refer, but they don't have to provide. And I mean, I guess it'd be interesting. I should look at what the numbers are where clinicians in the Netherlands say, I don't believe the suffering is sufficient. Mm-hmm. The person is not experiencing intolerable suffering, because that might give some indication of what would that group that maybe we might end up allowing that you're not allowing because of the subjectivity piece. Yeah. And partly why I mentioned I focused on the issue of as I think a brickbat that the subjectivity piece, the physician having to believe, is because I think that seems to have completely tied you in knots with respect to advance requests. Because if somebody does not have capacity to communicate, then the clinician is looking at them and saying, how can I know whether that person is suffering or not? Sometimes you can tell, of course, they're grimacing, they're screaming, and so on, but other times you can't. And so by having that physician requirement, you're making it impossible to do the advance requests. Yeah. So I think we have to wrestle with this question of what is the role of suffering in the context of an advance request when the person wasn't already experiencing the intolerable suffering when they made that advance request, which is that's what we're about to allow probably in Canada, is when you've already met it all. And that's one way around that problem, is that person will already have assessed that they are experiencing intolerable suffering. You do not then subsequently have a clinician who has to try to see from this person lying there that they can communicate with whether they're suffering or not.
Yeah. I don't know if it's a real difference, because in the Netherlands, the physician not so much has to agree as well as that he has to be convinced that this patient is indeed suffering. I mean, he can say, well, if I would be in that position, that would not be an unbearable suffering for me. But if you think that is unbearable suffering, then it's okay for me. So it's perhaps a little bit more nuanced than that. Yeah. But I agree with you that that's really difficult with respect to the advanced request issue. That's really true. Yeah.
I just wanted to pick up that numbers issue, because I know Australia is very much at the early days of this. So we have 124 cases in total. And when sort of put aside the numbers that we've seen in the Netherlands and Canada, that is extremely small. And yet when the Voluntary Assisted Dying Review Board released its report 3 weeks ago, the headline, in at least some newspapers, was 10 times the expected use of voluntary assisted dying in Victoria. Yeah. Because at one point in Parliament, one of the politicians had said, oh, look, we think it's going to be probably about 12 people might use this in the first year. So the figure that was sort of put forward was a 10-fold increase in expected use of voluntary assisted dying. Look, I think Jocelyn's point about, I mean, it's not really about numbers, it's about making sure that the people who have access, only those are eligible. And especially when you're thinking about, a permit system, which we have in Australia. I mean, the discussion that followed that sort of 10-fold increase was, well, okay, if you're going to pick a magic number, is there a quota? So that the first 100 people who are able to demonstrate they're eligible are able to have access to voluntary assisted dying. The rest of you, the permits are closed for this year. You'll have to queue up and experience whatever suffering it is until it opens again next year. So, I mean, that sort of demonstrates the absurdity of sort of, picking out what is the right number. It really is about eligibility. But interesting to see these debates, even with such a small number, happen the same the world over.
Thank you all. Following up on this point of kind of a future directive. We had a question around expanding the availability of dementia advanced directives to patients who are in the early or pre-dementia stages. And how do your respective countries, or I should say, how do you foresee your respective countries responding to this issue?
Well, in the Netherlands, I explained it, I think, it's already allowed. There are about, I think, hundreds of cases each year in which the suffering is mainly caused by an early stage of dementia. Patient is still competent and capable of doing a request, and then that request is granted. So in the Netherlands, it's already practice. It's rare. I mean, compared to the in total 6,000 cases, it's only a very small proportion, but it's accepted and it happens.
Yeah, so we're the next in line on the spectrum there, I would say. So you can qualify for MAiD already with dementia. There's a protocol, using that word loosely, about 10 minutes to midnight, where the patient is followed. They have dementia and they're followed closely by a clinician, because to get them as close, as far as they can, as much life as they can have, because they want to keep going, but before they are going to lose capacity. So you take them as close to the lost capacity, and then the clinician saying, look, I don't know that next week you're going to be capable. So it's sort of now or never. We're about to have advanced requests where if you meet all of the eligibility criteria, you can proceed. And dementia is a serious incurable condition. You can be in an advanced state of declining capability for a whole bunch of reasons. And early, even moderate dementia, you can have already lost, for instance, 3 languages you used to speak. Well, that's an advanced state of loss of decline. So you'll be able to get it that way. But the category that people are most concerned to see brought into law in Canada, which is not in the proposals yet, but I think we will see within a year if the Liberal government stays in power, which is where you're early, so you don't meet any of the criteria, but you want to say, look, I've got a diagnosis of dementia. And one thing that I would note is we've had multiple expert panels and committees and so on look at these issues and make recommendations. And we had, importantly, a provincial territorial expert advisory group and a special joint committee of the House and the Senate. And they're recommending that, look, once you've had that diagnosis, you should be able to make an advanced request. So if you have a diagnosis of dementia, you should be able to make it even before you've gotten close. They say not before a diagnosis of anything. Just thinking like maybe I'll have an accident or something. They didn't recommend that, but they do recommend that after the diagnosis with a grievous and irremediable medical condition, understood not in the narrow sense of our legislation, but the court, you should be able to make an advanced request. And that would capture the people with dementia who are most concerned about this in Canada. And as I say, there'll be a review, this committee is going to look at things. And I would not be surprised if we saw an allowing of advanced requests after diagnosis with a grievous condition, but before the onset of intolerable suffering.
Not permitted in Australia. There's no facility or function for advanced requests. It's probably no surprise. Look, of interest, though, is that the parliamentary committees and other bodies which are looking at that are seriously engaging with this issue. I think that's in part a function that so much of the impetus to think about voluntary assisted dying stems in the community from concerns about what happens with dementia diagnosis and what might follow. So, for example, the Queensland Parliamentary Inquiry didn't necessarily recommend that advanced directives be part of the next stage for Queensland in drafting its bill, but it did specifically recommend further investigation of this topic. So I think although the Australian approach has been quite narrow and conservative, I think we're at least seeing a recognition, an official recognition of the significance of this issue and trying to think about strategies to address it. So I think we'll be watching. I mean, the discussion that occurs in Australia looks very much the Netherlands, and I think with the changes in Canada, including the incremental changes that we might see with the laws that will come in, I think Queensland, Tasmania, other places will look very closely at that.
Excellent, thank you all. I want to jump to a question by Ashley Sweet. She asks about what is the review process that exists in the U.S. for medical aid in dying, and to ask all of you what your thoughts are. I know we touched a little bit on this, in the bouquets and brickbats, but I wanted to follow up and see, what is the current review process as it exists now in the United States, and to add to that, what ways could it be improved?
Maybe Agnes can go on the improved part as the researcher on the panel, the epidemiological researcher on the panel.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I'm well enough informed about the review process in the United States, but well, I think the most essential aspect of the review system in our country is, as Ben already mentioned as a bouquet of our system, is the transparency. Because there is the reports of the review committees are openly published. They contain many exemplary reviews of cases with the argumentation why it was considered to be adherent or not adherent to the criteria. And that's very helpful for physicians. And they have also published euthanasia code, as they call it, in which they explain how they interpret the requirements, because the requirements in the law are, of course, quite straightforward and open. They are not very specific and not very detailed, but in this code, they explain how they interpret the criteria for mainstream cases, not for every individual case, of course, but they explain how they proceed and how they work. And that's also very helpful for physicians. So in general, I would say the transparency and the openness of the review system is very worthwhile and very supportive also for physicians who want to engage in this practice.
This might be a moment to mention Quebec, because to its credit, it has a commission on end-of-life care, which I'd advocated that we have federally, but I didn't win on that one. And it is closer to what you see in Europe, which is the review of cases. And so the documentation is sent to a commission and the panel reviews it. And that gives you a window into the practices, and they are able to respond to individual providers and say, did you think about this? How about this? Maybe you shouldn't be doing this quite this way. Or it's not an egregious breach. It's just, establishing best practices, for instance, and then giving guidance generally to the profession and to those who are working on it. So I think that's a good thing, and that is not present in the U.S. I would note that the U.S. had data that was incredibly useful for the Canadian litigation, because there were the reports every year out of Oregon, and in part it's because your health and criminal are at the same level, they're state, and so you're able to integrate reporting in a way that we're unable to, haven't been so much able to in Canada. But that data and the data from the Netherlands and Belgium was crucial in demonstrating that there had not been a slippery slope anywhere in the world where MAiD was allowed. And I imagine in Australia, you relied similarly on it in the parliamentary process. And then everybody is helping each other, right? Because then you're able to turn to the Canadian court decision, which reviewed all the evidence and came to conclusions there's no slippery slope. And Tasmania, Mike Gaffney was over here talking to people. And so that reviewing is important, both for the purposes of assessing quality delivery. And on that, I would say the U.S. could do more. The American model is not robust. It's more like, we're closer to that in a sense than Quebec and the Netherlands. But on the other hand, kudos for having gathered all that data and made it public, because it has helped in the responsible evolution of MAiD law in other countries in the world.
Great. Ben, any thoughts?
Well, look, I guess just to pick up on Jocelyn's comment, that idea of evidence-based lawmaking is absolutely critical. And I think one of the things that has changed over time, we've seen, looking internationally, a very slow but steady process of voluntary assisted dying becoming lawful in a range of US states, in Canada, in parts of Australia. New Zealand has a referendum in a month. I think a big part of that is actually I guess what we've talked about, a shrinking battlefield. So some of the arguments to say that this is dangerous, this is tricky, this is concerning, we should be worried about that, That body of research, Netherlands, Oregon, and so on, has been absolutely pivotal. And that's not an argument sort of for or against, that's actually just an argument for good lawmaking, for using reliable evidence that we can be confident shows how practice works. And that's been very, very significant in Australia.
Wonderful, thank you all. So we are unfortunately running out of time, and we've received so many excellent questions. Instead of trying to cram in any more today, I'd love to point you to our website, completedlife.org, where we will post a summary of all of your excellent questions. And I would also point you to our Slack discussion board, available via the information on the slide here. And also make a follow-up note about CLE credit. That the second participation code is all caps completed, and we will be circulating the forms needed for CLE and CME credit for all of you via email. So you can additionally contact us via email at info@completedlife.org. And I just want to issue a big round of applause for all three of you, Jocelyn, Ben, and Agnes. And an additional round of applause for Ben staying up in the middle of the night in Australia and Queensland. We had a comment from Toby Myers in the audience that he thought you all deserve high praise, and you had a beautiful delivery of presentation. So thank you again so much for joining us, and thank you to our audience for being here today and participating so actively with such incredible, well thought out questions as well. And I also want to take a moment to look forward to next week's session 5, which will feature David Hoffman and Danielle Spencer, looking at the interdisciplinary of narratives of end-of-life challenges that result in organizational changes. And the session will explore narrative as an organizing principle, as well as a tool for incorporating the elements of personal narrative that define a completed life. So much to look forward to and much to celebrate with the three of you today. Thank you so much again. And to you in the audience, please feel free to tag us on social media at The Completed Life on Twitter and other social media. And please feel free to use the hashtag Completed Life. And we'll look forward to continuing the conversation on our Slack discussion board. So thank you all so much, and have a wonderful rest of your day.